Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something I think everyone experiences, right? That kind of mental ping pong where our thoughts just won't stay put. We've got this fascinating sermon excerpt that really digs into this whole idea of wandering thoughts. And, even though it's from a Methodist viewpoint, this isn't just old theology. It feels really relevant to anyone trying to focus or, live a more intentional life.
Exactly. And for you, the listener who wants to really get something quickly and thoroughly, but without feeling totally overwhelmed, this should provide some genuine aha moments. We're looking at a common human thing, the busy mind, but through a specific theological lens. It's less theory, more about how people have thought about what's happening up here.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission today really is to understand the different types of wandering thoughts this sermon talks about. Like, where do they come from? Which ones does it see as problematic for faith, maybe sinful, and which ones maybe aren't?
Right.
And then what does all that mean for how Methodists approach spiritual growth, holiness? We're using this written sermon as our guide. It's a really interesting historical take on our inner world.
Okay, so let's dive in. The sermon kicks off by setting up two main ways our thoughts tend to wander off. The first one, it's when thoughts wander from God. Now that sounds pretty significant.
It does.
Yeah.
Okay, so unpack that. The sermon apparently argues that sort of naturally our thoughts do drift away from God because it says humans are fundamentally without God in the world. The logic seems to be we think about what we love or what we value, right? And the sermon's point is that our default setting isn't automatically loving God above all else.
Precisely. And it continues, saying that even when we deliberately try to think about God, those thoughts can often feel a bit, the text uses the word insipid.
Insipid, meaning like bland,
Both.
lifeless.
Yeah, sort of flat, uninteresting, especially when compared to, our immediate concerns. Thoughts about food, clothes, sensory stuff, what we want to achieve or gain. Those tend to push the God thoughts aside pretty quickly if our focus is mainly worldly.
Yeah, that makes sense. But then it gets more serious. It also talks about thoughts that don't just wander away, but actively push against God.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. These come from what it calls the carnal mind, which is enmity against God. Strong language, like you said.
Yeah, enmity. Wow. What are the examples?
Well, things like unbelieving thoughts, denying God exists, or questioning his power, his wisdom, mercy, justice, holiness. Also, doubting God's providence, particularly his active role in things.
Okay.
Then there's complaining, murmuring, repining, discontent, proud thoughts, vain imaginations, angry or revengeful thoughts, even sensual fantasies. These aren't just random drifts. They show a mind actively resisting God.
Got it. So that's the first big category, thoughts moving away from or even fighting against God. What's the second type of wandering thought mentioned?
The second type is described as thoughts that wander from a particular point. This feels different.
How so?
Well, the sermon clarifies here that these aren't necessarily thoughts straying from God himself. It's more about our focus, our understanding, getting sidetracked from a specific subject we intended to think about.
Ah, okay. Like getting distracted mid-thought. Does it give an example?
It does, a really clear one. It imagines someone starting to think about the phrase, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, about spiritual struggle.
Right.
And then their mind gets pulled into thinking about the state of the Christian world. Maybe it's hypocrisies or failings. The focus shifts from the spiritual principle to judging others, essentially.
Ah, I see. So the core intention might still be generally spiritual,
Yeah,
but the specific focus just wandered off onto a related but different track.
exactly that. Your attention has just gone off on a tangent. And I think, this is probably the kind of wandering most of us experience constantly. That feeling of your mind just jumping tracks.
Definitely. Okay, so two main categories. Wandering from God and wandering from a point. Now, the sermon apparently goes into what triggers these. Let's start with the first kind, thoughts supposing that we're wandering from God. What causes those, according to the text?
Right. So the sermon links these directly to what it calls sinful tempers, basically our underlying negative inclinations or dispositions.
So our inner state dictates our thoughts.
Pretty much. It draws a direct line. For example, it says, unbelief, a lack of faith is the root cause of either not thinking about God or actively thinking against him.
Makes sense. Like it tracks like, almost.
Yeah, and it expands on that. A love of the world, prioritizing earthly things over God, which it calls a kind of idolatry, naturally leads your thoughts constantly back to worldly stuff.
Okay.
And similarly, pride, anger, vengefulness, vanity, lust, greed, Each of these negative states is seen as a generator for specific types of thoughts that align with that state.
So it's like the cycle. The inner temper fuels the thought, and maybe the thought reinforces the temper.
That's a good way to put it. Now, what about the other kind? Those thoughts that just wander from a specific point. The triggers there are more varied, right?
Yes, much more varied. The sermon points to several things. First, just the basic reality of the soul and body being linked.
Ah, the mind-body connection.
Exactly. It talks about how physical illness, like a diseased body, or even temporary things like a high fever causing delirium or nervous disorders, can really shake our ability to think straight. There's a striking quote, "The corruptible body pressed down the soul and caused it to muse about many things." It really captures that feeling.
That is a powerful image. Our physical state literally weighing down our focus. What else?
Well, sleep and dreams are mentioned, obviously. Thoughts are pretty uncontrollable then.
Sure.
And also just general bodily states feeling sluggish and heavy versus having really maybe overly lively imagination. Both can lead to that sort of mental drifting.
It's like our mind has its own weather patterns affecting where thoughts go.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And then there's something we definitely all know. Involuntary associations of ideas.
Oh, yeah.
The sermon uses this image of a spark hitting the end of a train of gunpowder. How one thought can just randomly ignite another, totally unrelated one, and send your mind careening off track.
I know that feeling. You're thinking about, I don't know, work, and suddenly you're thinking about something that happened in childhood, and you're like, where did that come from?
Totally. The sermon also notes how strong sensations, intense pleasure or pain, naturally demand our attention, pulling focus.
Right. Hard to ignore.
And of course, external things, sights, sounds, just the world around us constantly interrupting.
So it paints a picture of the mind being, well, constantly affected by internal states, bodily functions, random connections, and the outside world, all leading to these kinds of wandering thoughts.
But then it adds another layer, doesn't it? A spiritual one. Something about evil spirits.
Yes, it does. The sermon suggests that evil spirits can, and do, use all these natural triggers, the body, associations, external stimuli to distract and harass people, especially when they're trying to focus on God or prayer. It even suggests they understand the springs of thought and can sometimes inject thoughts directly.
That's a very traditional view, maybe one we don't hear as much today, but it highlights that sense that distractions can sometimes feel almost like an external attack on our focus.
It does frame it that way. So, okay, we have the types of wandering and the potential causes. Now, the really crucial part. Which ones does the sermon say are sinful and which aren't? This is where it gets really practical for faith.
Right. This feels key. So, according to this sermon, which wandering thoughts are actually sinful?
It's pretty direct. First, thoughts that wander from God, the kind that imply living as if God isn't real or relevant, leaving us without God in the world. That's seen as inherently sinful.
Okay, a fundamental turning away.
Yes. And second, thoughts that are actively contrary to God, showing opposition, hostility, things like murmuring, complaining against God, doubting his existence or attributes, and crucially, doubting his particular providence.
Particular providence, meaning not just a general sense God's in charge, but his active involvement in my life, these circumstances.
Exactly that. Doubting that specific active involvement is considered sinful here.
Interesting distinction. What else?
Also, any thoughts that spring directly from those sinful tempers, we talked about revenge, pride, lust, vanity. The logic is like, an evil tree cannot bring forth good fruit. If the root is sinful, the thought is too.
Okay.
And relatedly, thoughts that feed or encourage those sinful tempers, thoughts that lead you deeper into pride or anger or worldly desires.
It's very focused on the inner source and effect of the thought, isn't it? Less about just the surface content.
Very much so, and it adds another layer. Even thoughts that initially come from weakness or illness or external factors or even demonic suggestion, they can become sinful.
Right.
If we give place to them, if we entertain them, dwell on them, make them our own, and let them stir up or cherish sinful desires, desire of the flesh, desire of the eyes, the pride of life, as the Bible puts it.
So it's about our response, not just the thought popping in, but whether we latch onto it and nurture the negativity it brings.
Precisely. That engagement is key. Now, on the flip side, there are wandering thoughts the sermon explicitly says are not sinful. Mostly those in the second category wandering from a particular point.
Okay, this must be where some relief comes in for people who struggle with focus. What falls into this non-sinful category?
Well, it compares them to natural bodily processes like blood flow or nerve activity, just part of being human.
Right.
So thoughts arising from physical infirmity, weakness, illness, bad nerves, fever, delirium, these aren't considered sinful in themselves. Neither are thoughts that just spring from the body-soul connection or changes in our physical state that affect thinking.
So if you're sick and your mind feels foggy and distracted, that's not a moral failing, according to this view.
Yeah. Correct. Also in this category are thoughts from those random, involuntary associations of ideas we mentioned.
The gunpowder train thing.
Exactly. And thoughts triggered by things we can't help but see or hear. It's not a sin, the sermon says, just to perceive unavoidable things happening around you.
Okay. And what about those thoughts suggested by the devil, the injected ones?
This is interesting. While it calls them troublesome, the sermon argues they are not sinful in themselves.
Really?
Yeah. It uses the example of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. Satan put thoughts and suggestions into his mind, but Jesus experiencing those thoughts wasn't sinful. The sin would have been embracing them, agreeing with them, acting on them.
Ah, I see.
So likewise, the sermon suggests that just because a harmful or distracting thought is injected into our mind, that doesn't make us sinful. The sin comes if we welcome it, dwell on it, let it take root, and lead to sinful desires or actions.
So again, it comes back to our response, our engagement with the thought, not just its initial appearance, even if it feels like it came from outside.
Exactly. And this whole distinction between the sinful wandering from God or rooted in sin and the non-sinful wandering from a point due to our nature, this has huge implications for Methodist faith and practice, which brings us right to the heart of our deep dive today.
Yes, absolutely. Let's focus on that. How does this way of understanding wandering thoughts shape Methodist faith and practice? You mentioned it tackles perfection in love, which is a big deal in Methodism.
It is a very central concept. And the sermon asks point blank, does achieving this perfection in love mean you have to be totally free from all wandering thoughts?
And the answer is?
The answer it gives is quite definitively no. It argues that wandering thoughts of the second kind, the non-sinful distractions, are actually compatible with being perfected in love.
Okay, that's really significant. So striving for that deep love of God doesn't mean aiming for a completely empty or distraction-proof mind.
Exactly. The reasoning is quite practical. If perfect love required no wandering thoughts, then things like feeling physical pain or even just sleeping, both of which disrupt focused thought, would also be incompatible with it, which seems absurd.
Yeah, that's very grounded, except we live in physical bodies. So if eliminating all stray thoughts isn't the goal, what is the focus for spiritual growth here?
The focus, and this fits right in with the Methodist emphasis on inward holiness, is on the orientation of the heart. Is your fundamental desire, your love, directed towards God? That's the key, not achieving flawless mental control.
So the goal is deliverance from the sinful kind of wandering thoughts, the ones that show the heart is turned away.
That's the expectation for those growing in perfect love, yes. Deliverance from thoughts rooted in unbelief, pride, worldliness, anger, and so on.
Okay, it's about the heart's compass pointing truly towards God, rather than perfect mental stillness. That must have some really practical implications for daily life, right? How should someone approach their own wandering thoughts with this understanding?
Definitely. The sermon suggests a few things. First, self-examination should focus on the nature and origin of the thought. Ask yourself, is this coming from a sinful desire, or is it more likely just a mental hiccup, a distraction because I'm tired or stressed or because the TV is on?
So less immediate self-condemnation for every stray thought, more discernment about its source.
Precisely. Second, it emphasizes grace and forgiveness. Recognize that non-sinful wandering thoughts are just part of being human in this body. Don't get, as the sermon warns, greatly distressed and hurt in their souls by misunderstanding this and beating yourself up over normal distractions.
That sounds much healthier, actually. More compassionate, accepting limitations.
It is. Then the primary strategy it proposes for dealing with sinful wandering thoughts isn't just trying to suppress them, but actively cultivating love for God and working to root out the underlying sinful tempers that generate them.
So changing the soil, not just pulling the weeds.
Exactly. And prayer for deliverance from these sinful thoughts is vital, expected for anyone seeking holiness.
So building the positive love for God and actively praying against the negative roots.
Correct. And alongside that, there's an acceptance that the non-sinful kind will likely continue as long as we're embodied. The encouragement is to pray that even these distractions might somehow work together for our good, and that we can be more than conquerors even amidst them.
Learning to navigate the mental noise rather than expecting silence this side of eternity.
You've got it. The sermon points to the resurrection and eternal rest as the time when we'll finally be free from all wandering thoughts linked to the body, the world, and evil spirits. It's a long-term hope.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive,
Mhm.
the sermon makes this really vital distinction. Wandering thoughts rooted in a heart turned from God, or expressing sin. Those are the problem. But the everyday mental distractions arising from our physical nature, external world, random associations, those are often not sinful and are compatible even with deep spiritual maturity, like perfection and love.
That's the core insight. Yeah. Growth is about the heart's direction and freedom from sin, not achieving an impossible mental quietude while we're still human.
And thinking about this, it really offers a different lens for looking at our own minds, doesn't it? When your mind wanders, maybe the question isn't just, oh no, I got distracted again, but okay, where did that thought come from? What's it telling me about my heart right now? It could take some pressure off, maybe relieve some of that distress the sermon mentioned.
It really could. And it leaves you with this final thought to consider. In our incredibly distraction-filled world today, constant notifications, endless input, how does this perspective shape how we approach things like prayer or meditation? Is the goal truly to silence the mind, to block everything out, or is it maybe more about cultivating a heart that learns to consistently return to God again and again, right in the midst of all that noise? Perhaps the real spiritual discipline isn't achieving emptiness, but fostering a heart that's always being drawn back to its true center, even when our thoughts seem determined to wander everywhere else.